Hey everybody, welcome back to Truth Revealed. As always, I'm your host, Sergio Denaro. Just a little bit about me. I'm a former human intelligence collector with the military. If you want my whole bio, just look on my YouTube homepage. Today, we are going to be looking at Brian Albert. Finally, right? When I started my YouTube channel 3 months ago, I was looking at the Karen Reed case, and I've done a few of the witnesses up to this point. I've been waiting a little bit to do Brian Albert because I was trying to find that balance of how my videos could best reach the most number of people. So starting with this video, I'm going to make them with the intent of creating a masterclass video and simultaneously releasing a highlight video that's going to be very condensed, as short as I can possibly make it. If you're having difficulty up to this point really believing that the end result of what I'm doing is 100% accurate, it's because I haven't been showing you all of the work that I've been doing up to this point. And it's curtailed. The reason I haven't been doing a lot more is because I feel like people just generally aren't interested in the minute detail. All of that is changing now. At this point, my masterclass is going to have all the detail, but the masterclass is going to be everything. If you're interested in knowing exactly how I do what I do, you're going to see that. And I'm going to pull 100% of the information for you, and we're going to put everything together. If I haven't made it clear up to this point, the masterclass version of my videos is going to go into great detail. So you will get to see my full brain on display here. You're not going to get an edited version of it. Now, remember, if you've already seen my videos and you just want the highlights on this one, watch the highlight video. You're only going to miss the details. You're not going to miss the outcome. I'm not going to miss any of the good stuff, like the answers that look like an entire rainbow threw up all over it. For this masterclass, I will be heavily emphasizing baselining. That's the one thing that I have skipped over the most up to this point. Of all the stuff that I'm editing out of the videos in order to make them a reasonable amount of time, baselining is probably the greatest casualty. And I figured that it was probably the least interesting to you. However, I'm finding that a lot of people don't believe what I'm saying because there are differences sometimes. For example, when some people repeat I once, so they say I, for some people that is definitive deception. For other people, it means mild sensitivity. And for others, it means great sensitivity, but not necessarily deception. So why do I have all these rules and why do these rules change? Well, it depends on the person's baseline. I start by going through the entire statement and finding out, how do people use repeated words? For example, do people repeat words as a way of formulating a coherent sentence, or do they use repeating words as a way of fabricating? I have been doing all of this stuff in the background, and then I just tell you as I'm going through it, a repeated I, that means deception. And that can make it difficult for you to apply these rules later if you don't see how I baseline the person. Once you understand someone's baseline, you will understand where they're deceptive. You will understand how to tailor the words that you choose while you're interrogating them. And I'm not talking about necessarily an interrogator in an interrogation booth. If your significant other, if you think they're cheating on you, if you sit down and start asking them questions, you are interrogating them. And I want to give you the right information here so that you can conduct your own interrogations in your own personal life and get the truth. Let's go ahead and get started. So in red, we have the question itself. All of these are going to be from ADA Lally. In black, I have the answer to the question. That is going to be from Brian Albert. In purple, I have my notes. Do you have siblings? And he says, I do. This is a very high commitment statement. He could have said yes. This is a yes or no question, but he chooses not to say yes. He chooses to say, I do, which, like I said, that is a high commitment way of speaking. One thing that a lot of people are not used to is assigning a level of commitment to the words that they hear. Yes is a mid-level commitment, which means when it's used as one word only, it can be used as deception. To make up an entire sentence, it makes your stress live out over an extended period of time. So it's better to just end your stress quickly and say yes. That's why yes is not a high commitment statement. If he says, I do, the chances of him lying when he says I do is very slim because he's putting a level of commitment that is higher than the word yes on this. So he is very consistent with the way that he answers questions. This is not unexpected for somebody who's been in law enforcement. I would expect their answers to be concise and precise, exactly how they are here. He says, that's 34 Fairview Road. Is that right? And now we get a yes with no further explanation or increased level of commitment here, because we're back to a house that we know was sensitive. Obviously, he has a bad association to the house. We know that with certainty. He uses the word yes, the low commitment version, with nothing attached to it. So we call it a one-word answer. So you'll see me abbreviate it as a one-word answer. And we know that a one-word answer here means he's feeling sensitive here. Whenever people cut that answer down to a one-word answer, it means we're done talking about this. I have nothing left to tell you about this subject. Now we're seeing huge sensitivity. That tells us that not only that he's sensitive about the house, but when he is sensitive about a topic, he uses one-word answers, yes or no. Okay. If I could turn your attention to January 28th, do you recall that date? All right. Now we're getting into sensitive questions here. Now we've got our baseline, as much of it as we can get up to this point, and we're going to start getting into questions that might deviate from this. So if I could turn your attention, do you recall that date? He says yes. Ooh, good. This is right in line with his baseline so far. January 28th is a sensitive date. His residence is a sensitive residence. He does not want to elaborate on everything that happened. He's just going to let you ask questions. This is a sensitive answer to a question that is in reference to a sensitive time. And so one word answer. And do you recall that day of the week, what it was? He says the 28th, I believe, was a Friday. I believe is how do I say this? There are varying degrees of minimizing commitment to your statement. I believe is probably the highest commitment level that you can have in a reduction of commitment statement. Okay, when you first got up on the 28th, where were you at that point? And he says, on the 28th, I was in New York City. It's hard to tell if the repetition here is New York State, New York City, or if he's actually repeating New York. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt here because it's possible that somebody might say I was in New York, meaning the state, which means they could have been in a different city other than New York City. So when he says on the 28th, I was in New York City, because he very intentionally makes the second part of this more specific in a way that you and I can recognize as a detail that could be needed here, I don't consider this to be word repetition. Word repetition is an indicator. So I don't think that this is an indicator at this point. Lally says, why had you gone to New York? He says, we have not seen this to this point. Beginning an answer with an explanatory statement is a big indicator. Seeing the word so here is very sensitive. It's not something he's ever done before. Why had you gone to New York? That is a very direct question. And the answer should not be sensitive. At this point, Lally doesn't even expect anything to be sensitive. He is literally just trying to set the stage. So for you to see sensitivity here, this is odd. And it's something that we do not want to dismiss. Notice I uncontracted do not want to dismiss, because I want to emphasize that point. He says, so I went to New York for a funeral. Really? Now we have a repeated word that there's no reason to repeat this word. This is a repeated word. The indicator. It's a repeated word indicator. New York for a funeral of a New York City police officer who was killed in the line of duty. The fact that there's no indicators in here doesn't really tell us that this is a truthful statement, because we have indicators. We have two indicators here, which means that this could be rehearsed. Is this how you would rehearse it? Is this a phrase that you would rehearse like this? We went to the funeral of a New York City police officer who was killed in the line of duty. Actually, yeah, that's how you would rehearse that, which means I can't give any credibility to this just because there's no indicator in here. So we do need to pay attention to this. This is wrong. This is not by his baseline. So the first question where the answer isn't known and we see an X, which is an explanatory statement, as the first word. That's interesting. You don't see that very often. So we're going to notate that. Later, we will see that this indicates high sensitivity and deception. This is deceptive. You are going to get evidence of this because it's a reoccurring thing, not simply because I saw this once. There are very few definitive that every single time you see one particular indicator, it means deception. What means deception is seeing multiple indicators together. The statement has to scream deception, and you want to see a pattern. So here we have two indicators. We have a repeated word and we have an explanatory as the first word in the statement. He went to New York for a different reason. That we will know by the end of this. Okay, what day did you go down to New York? So he says, we went down. There was more than just him. We went down the day before. So I believe that was Thursday. Okay, that's interesting, because when he was asked what day of the week was the 28th, he says the 28th, I believe, was a Friday. So I would expect to see his truthful answer to be something like, I believe, like, what day did you go down there? I believe that was the 27th, or I believe that was Thursday. Either one of those answers would have been in line with his baseline. This is not. So he says, we went down the day before. Before is a missing time indicator. So we know that this means before something. He is insinuating the funeral, but he doesn't say it. That means I can tell you definitively that he went down before something, but I absolutely cannot tell you that that was before the funeral. I would expect to see the word funeral here. He just literally cuts himself off in the middle of the sentence, which means it's highly likely, it's highly probable that he went down before something else. He could have still traveled on Thursday, but he went down the day before the real reason why he went there. That's literally the only thing that this tells you. So I believe that was Thursday. Okay, this would have been the truthful answer. He could have said, I believe that was Thursday. What day did you go down to New York? This is actually a complete answer to that question. There's no reason to have the rest of this in here. And because we know that he speaks concise and with precision, none of these words should be here because they are there. And because we have an explanatory statement, we have missing time, and we have a sentence fragment. Now, this might be technically a sentence, but it's actually a fragment in his mind because he doesn't tell you before what. I'm willing to say definitively here that these indicators mean that he went down for a different reason than the funeral. It doesn't necessarily mean it's nefarious. He might have went down to buy a gift for his wife. Yeah, I mean, who knows? But whatever the real reason is, he's not telling you. So we have the break right here. This is what we want to be aware of. All right, let's move on. How it was that you got down there. It's the most sense I can make out of what he said. So he says, yes, I flew to New York. This is a repeating phrase, and he's also repeating the word I in the repeating phrase. We have repetition of I and repetition of flew. This is an indicator. This means whatever he just said here is sensitive. It has meaning to him other than the meaning that he is portraying to you. He says, I flew to New York. He did not fly by himself. He flew with other people. He says, we went down there before. So we don't know who they are, but we know that there was more than just him. Who, if anyone, went with you on the trip to New York? He says, because he says we earlier. He says, I flew with a friend and a coworker named Eddie Hernandez. We have I flew, we have with. With is an indicator of conflict. So whoever he's about to say he flew with, he had conflict with. And then he says, a friend. By not saying my, by using a non-possessive pronoun, that is another indicator of conflict. So Brian Albert definitely has conflict with the friend, which is Eddie Hernandez. So we know that there's conflict with Eddie. He says he flew with a friend and a coworker. So this is weird. We don't know whether he flew with two people. One was a friend and one was a coworker. Because he says Eddie Hernandez, most people would say a friend and coworker, but he says a friend and a coworker. So there's something deceptive about this. He is insinuating that there's three people, but he's only telling you that there's one person, Eddie, and he is telling you that he has conflict with Eddie. That's all we know at this point. Included within those people mentioned, you have a brother, Kevin, is that correct? And he says, yes. Well, now we got a one-word answer, and Kevin is a family member, so we would expect a higher level of commitment than just the word yes. There's a problem with Kevin here. Now, is the problem conflict with Kevin? That was my first thought, but we have to think through this because the only thing that we know with absolute certainty is that there's sensitivity around Kevin. We don't know that he has conflict. We didn't see any other indicators. He doesn't use with. He didn't use a non-possessive pronoun. He did leave Kevin out up here, so we don't know how Kevin got there. Kevin is his brother. So how did Kevin get there? If he flew with Kevin and didn't mention that up here, there's something that he doesn't want you to know about Kevin. If he shows later that he has a good relationship with Kevin, I go back to this question and say, okay, then we can be pretty certain that Kevin has information that Brian Albert doesn't want police to ask Kevin because of this trip, or he just simply doesn't want to drag another one of his family members into this whole ordeal, which is possible. Is he a police officer as well? He is. So he doesn't say yes. Yes would be sensitivity around that. And Brian Albert is not sensitive about that. Okay, was he down at the funeral as well? He was. Okay, that's a direct answer to the question, But we are not getting the answer to the implied question, which is, did he go with you? But Lally didn't ask that question. And so garbage in, garbage out. If you don't ask the question, I can't definitively say here that Brian Albert's hiding it. So you know a gentleman by the name of Brian Higgins. So Lally, instead of asking the question, did he fly with you? Did he go there with you? Which would have been important because it means that he left that out of the stuff above. He moves on. So we have to move on. Let's see. You know a gentleman by the name of Brian Higgins? Yes. Yes is a word that means sensitivity to Brian Albert. So there's no I do this time. Brian Higgins is not on the level of family. Not only is he not on the level of family, there's sensitivity there. So we want to keep that in mind as we keep going here. How is it that you know Brian Higgins? And he says, so interesting. We know immediately there's sensitivity here. How do you know Brian Higgins? So I know Brian Higgins initially from work, a professional relationship. I've known him or known of him for 10 or 15 years. Okay, this is a much broader span of time than he was giving before. It's not necessarily deceptive, but he says he's known him or known of him. So he's probably known him for closer to 10 years and known of him for closer to 15. And then the past few years, more recently, we worked together. Okay, it's an indicator of closeness here. We worked together on a closer basis. Working together on a closer basis. There's sensitivity to that. So them working together is something that is creating sensitivity here on a closer basis. And I became better friends with him. This is a problem. Can you see the problem here? He says with. With is a big indicator of conflict. I is separated as far as he can get I in that sentence away from himself. Brian Albert says, we worked together on a closer basis and I became better friends with him. So this sensitivity is likely due to this conflict and I became better friends with him. Now I am going to say, I don't believe you. This is deception. We have one indicator here. We have two indicators of conflict that go along with that. And because the words that he's saying is that they became better friends, they didn't become better friends. They were working together, but Brian Albert's opinion of Brian Higgins went down over the last 3 years, not up. So that is what I'm getting from his indicators and sensitivity here. So this starts with an explanatory statement. We want to remember that. That means there's going to be a lie in here, and we found the lie. It's right at the end here. Repeating AA, which leads into the rest of this. I and him separated. Note, it was we. Oh yeah, it was we right here before they started working together. Then we worked together on a closer basis, and I became better friends with him. This tells you very specifically and very clearly that he considered him a friend until they started working together. And then when they started working together on a closer basis, that friendship went downhill. And then Lally says, fair to say that when he became better friends with you, you also sort of socialized with him outside of work? And Brian says, yes. Sensitive. It's too short. It's a sensitive answer here. This answer's too short for baseline. However, we know this because Brian Albert doesn't like Brian Higgins, so this checks out. And we can see that this ties directly to this question here. Do you begin to socialize with him? Technically, yes, but he didn't necessarily want to socialize with him more, but he did. Why did you drive versus fly back? Oh, well, if that's what you meant, why didn't you ask that the first time? Let's see if we get a better answer here. Yep, we know right off the bat we're going to get a better answer here. So that weekend, we have distance, okay? That weekend, there was anticipated snowstorm. Oof, okay. So we have something about the snowstorm or something coming up from the snowstorm is sensitive to him. And I believe, okay, this generally is going to check out the flight that, okay, now we have another distancing indicator that we were taking with JetBlue. So this is stumbling on a word, but that's interesting because JetBlue, the only way to stumble on that is if your mind is completely somewhere else. He has to be thinking hard about the end of this sentence in order to misenunciate JetBlue. So this is an indicator of sensitivity, not in this answer, not in the fact that it's JetBlue, but in the fact that his mind is occupied. So we have two indicators that his mind is occupied here. He says, I believe that the flight that we were taking with JetBlue may have been canceled. He starts with a reduction of commitment that is usually a good reduction, but then he changes it to may. May is the absolute opposite of believe. I'm going to throw out random numbers here. This is something that I don't have statistics on, but let's say that 90% of the time that you say believe, you're telling the truth, then 90% of the time you say may, you're actually being deceptive. We have, I believe the flight may have been canceled and Brian Higgins was leaving. Okay, let's talk about this first. May have been canceled. Because he uses both of these indicators in here, but may is the one that he uses right before it. He might have assumed that it was canceled, but that's not the reason why he drove back with Brian Higgins. By saying may, he's saying that he doesn't know. He doesn't have any firsthand knowledge of whether the flight was canceled or not. He didn't check it. So he drove back and he says, and Brian Higgins, that's the first time he mentions Brian Higgins, and he gives the full name. Brian Higgins was leaving, all right, we know leaving's a problem, in a vehicle that morning. Okay, that morning, that's interesting because we don't know when the funeral was, but if he left the morning of the funeral, I'm not sure how you could go to the funeral if you actually left in the morning. Most of the time, if the funeral's in the morning, somebody would either say that he was leaving right after the funeral or he was leaving in the afternoon, something like that. He says he was leaving in the morning. Morning typically means technically it's going to be any time before noon, but most people don't use the word morning if they're talking about around noon. Mornings usually ends at about 10 o'clock, McDonald's style. And keep in mind, I'm old, so I mean McDonald's from the 1980s. I don't know what time they're open now for breakfast. So he says that Brian Higgins left in the morning. So we ended up driving, or after the funeral, we ended up driving with him. We have a bunch of problems here. We have an explanatory statement. We have a missing time. We ended up driving. And then he says, or in order to fix what you just said, if you said something incorrect, is not the right word there. You'd normally say, I mean. You'd say, so we ended up driving. I mean, after the funeral, we ended up driving. But he says, or. So this is odd. So we ended up driving. There's missing time here. A funeral is one of those activities that you gloss over. There's going to church, there's going to a movie, there's watching the big game. Those are things that you should see the word after. So the word after here is missing time, and that missing time is the funeral. These marry up, and this is not a problem. This is not missing time meaning an indicator of something. The ended up is problematic, though. He says, so we ended up driving, or after the funeral, we ended up driving with him. This tells me that they left in the morning, and then he's thinking, I told them that I went to the funeral. So we ended up driving, or after the funeral, we ended up driving. But ended up means that there's some sort of incident here. There's a timeline where they got up in the morning, something happened, there's an incident that is missing time, and then ended up driving in the morning. I'm willing to say at this point they didn't go to the funeral. The fact that this is an afterthought that he tries to fix and doesn't fix correctly is very problematic. And then ended up. If the reason that they went back was because of the snowstorm, he would have said, because of the snowstorm, we ended up. Then the snowstorm would be tied to ending up. Or if he just said, because of the snowstorm, we drove back early, then that would have been okay. But he doesn't. He only says we ended up, which means we have definitely a missing incident here. There is something that happened before they drove back. And then he says we ended up driving back with him. So we have an indicator of conflict with Brian Higgins. And we expect to see the with because we already know that Brian Albert does not particularly like Brian Higgins, but this conflict here could have been due to the missing incident here. This could be something as simple as we were intending on going back. Our flight wasn't until, let's say, 6 p.m. And we were expecting the snowstorm to get so bad that I was expecting that my flight would probably be canceled by that point. So I asked Brian Higgins if we could drive back with him after the funeral. And he said, sure. So we all drove back together. That is how a normal person would give you the chain of events. But that's not what we got here. So we know that there was some incident, and it probably included Brian Higgins not wanting to drive them back. And that's all we really get from this. So who knows what happened? Maybe Brian Higgins stayed up drinking all night, going to clubs, who knows, whatever, didn't go to the funeral and was just going to drive back in the morning and didn't want to explain all that, why he wasn't going to the funeral. We don't know what the truth is here, but we do know that this story is not the truth. Okay, it's possible that Brian Higgins didn't want to wait until after the funeral. It's possible that Brian Albert was saying, hey, after the funeral, let's all drive back together. And Brian Higgins was like, I have no intention of waiting until after the funeral. And that could be what caused this whole thing here.